Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Reasonable Doubt, brought to you by the Harris County Criminal Lawyers Association. I'm your host, Jimmy Ardwan, along with my co-host and horrible NBA basketball prognosticator, Julio Vela. Julio, how's that pick going for you?
What?
Yeah, exactly.
What
I hope you didn't go put any money on that, man.
What?
Yeah, silence. Silence.
What?
Anyway, we're going to have a great show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Joining us tonight, returning to the show, Sean Buckley, fresh off his return from the Dominican Republic. We're going to talk about that case here in a little bit.
Good evening.
And also joining us, Troy McKinney. This is the first time you've joined us, Troy.
It's the first time I've joined y'all. I've
That's
been
right.
here many times in the past before that.
But we're glad to have you on finally.
Happy to be here.
First time with Julio and I. We're not going to ask anybody to make any basketball predictions because clearly that has just gone epically wrong on this show.
I'll predict sweep.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
Yeah,
Hey,
exactly.
there's a difference between how James joined the Miami or any of his teams than how Kevin Durant joined his team.
You're right. On James's team, they signed 3 superstars at the same time. Durant was only one.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and they had drafted everybody else. But we got a great show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. There's been some breaking news. It's been a hell of a Thursday here, not just in Houston, but in the country overall. So we're going to talk about all of that. We're going to open up the phone lines about 8:30. 713-807-1794 is the number. You can also hit us up on Twitter. I got that right here in front of me. So send us your question and comments at HCCLA_TV. But first thing I want to talk about before we get into kind of the current events, guys, is Sean, I want to talk about your case. You and I have been texting back and forth, kind of communicating about this case, and we talked about it. A few months ago when the first trial date was coming up. But you represented a man locally here from Spring, Larry Davis, who was arrested and accused with a large-scale drug possession charge down in the Dominican Republic. He was held for over a year in custody, awaiting trial down there, and you finally saw justice, got an acquittal, and now he's back in this country. You brought some great pictures with us as well. We'll get to those in a little bit, but just overall, we were talking before the show, and I kind of wanted, it was interesting. I want you to share what you were talking with us about in terms of the overall legal experience with our viewers.
So the legal experience was very different. It was almost like being in a Dr. Seuss book because things are so different there in just the common way that people practice law. The lawyers have to wear a special garb. They wear a robe when they go to court. They wear a hat that looks like a ski hat because it has a ball, like a furry ball on top. And the color of the trim on these outfits corresponds to the duty of the person in the courtroom. For example, a prosecutor has blue trim, a public defender has green trim, and a defense lawyer typically in private practice has white trim. And there are some other modifiers that you can add to this outfit depending on your level of experience or your qualifications. But aside from that, I found the experience to be fascinating, and it is easy to conclude that, this is this wacky justice system in a banana republic, and wow, compared to the United States, look at this crappy system. But what I found, and after practicing in Harris County for almost 2 decades now, what I found upon reflection was that it's the same game that we have here, and the bottom line is this: if you have money to spend defending yourself, your chances of being exonerated if you're innocent or getting the best possible outcome, even if you're not, is tied to your ability to pay to defend yourself.
And we talked about your client was held for over a year while facing this. It was a substantial amount of drugs that he was charged with. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it was found on a boat that he owned, but that he leased to another person.
That's right.
Down in the Dominican Republic. And so, of course, they thought he was involved in this massive drug running operation down there. But people are going to look at it, like you said, about a third world country and say he got locked up for over a year. Oh, the horrible injustice. That goes on every day in this country.
Well, particularly if you look at the federal system here in the United States, with that much drugs, they could have easily alleged that my client was involved in a conspiracy, which doesn't require them to allege much more than just the basic allegation that he knew and was helping someone else commit this crime. And with that kind of allegation under the rules of our federal system, which is considered the most refined criminal justice system in the country, he would have been, the rules would have required the federal judge to hold him in custody for that period of time. So if you reverse it and you have a Dominican here who is in the same position that my client was in, but in the Dominican Republic, the results would have been the same in terms of him being detained.
Would your client have been detained or charged in the first place with the facts on this case had he been in the United States?
I don't think so, and I think that's a key difference. I think that one thing that we have here, as Troy's alluding to, is that we do have some filters on the early end of a criminal investigation in a criminal case, and this is going to tie into, I know, where we're headed eventually, which is the grand jury process. And in the United States, one of the critiques of the grand jury process is that grand jurors just do what the prosecutors ask them to do. And so procedurally, I think we do have some more protections here in the United States. The question is, as a practical matter, do they make a difference?
Yeah. I mean,
in the Dominican, are there jury trials, or what is your experience with that? Are there jury trials, or they're not?
No, there is not a jury system. It's based on the French system, the Napoleonic Code. The reason for that is, the other half of the island of Hispaniola, where the DR is located, is occupied by Haiti. And Haiti is French. And there was a time when the French controlled and created the framework for the way the entire island works, even though half of it now is Spanish-speaking, or two-thirds of it. But there is no jury system, and the number of judges who hear the case corresponds to the seriousness of the case. So in a minor dispute or a misdemeanor, you might just get one judge. But in a more serious case, you get more judges.
I think we have some pictures as well, if we could put them up, of the courtroom and the prison where your client was detained while awaiting trial. There's a picture of the courtroom.
Yes.
Doesn't look that much different than what we have here in Harris County, frankly.
It's very similar. One of the differences that you can't see from that photograph is that it's about 89 or 90 degrees outside, and there's no air conditioning in the courtroom.
I was going to ask, is there air conditioning as a joke, but that's serious.
And so I wore a suit every day. Some of the other gringos would dress down, but I felt that because my job was as a lawyer, even though I didn't wear the garb that they wore, I wanted to show respect for the court. So I always wore a suit and tie, and it was drenched at the end of the day.
Even though you were sweating to death.
Right.
Now, what are some of these pictures?
This is the scene outside the courthouse on the last day of trial, and in fairness to the storyline, this is not because of our case. It was because a scandal broke loose, a bribery scandal, where a number of the top-ranking ministers and foreign officials or domestic officials in the Dominican Republic were under arrest. And so they clamped down the courthouse. And I think that was a good thing for our case, because everybody was looking somewhere else when it came time for the judges to decide what to do about us.
Interesting. Now in the system down there, does the government have a right to appeal the judges?
Yes. The government is still determining whether they're going to appeal. My thought is, based on the word that I'm hearing, is that they won't, and that's also based on my observation of how we came to be where we are now. So I know that's kind of a cryptic comment, but I don't think the government will appeal. But in any event, I am certain that if they do, that Mr. Davis will not be extradited to the DR.
That's always. Did the judges explain their ruling, or just simply say not guilty?
They explained their ruling, and that's a good question, Troy, because the judges expressed some hostility toward the prosecution. The prosecution, even in the Dominican system, was required to link my client to the drugs, even though the drugs were found on his boat. And the judges chastised the prosecution for failing to do that and failing to spend their resources investigating it. If they felt that they didn't have a case, well, at least use resources to investigate. And so they chastised them for that. Not only did they order the immediate release of my client, but they ordered the immediate release of the $1 million boat that they've seized. So,
speaking of the boat, was this just a sailboat, or was this a big yacht, or was it a cargo ship of some kind?
I wish it was a yacht, because I would find a way to get
sail
that
back.
How that come?
Might have taken it back.
It was an oil or a diesel fuel transport ship, approximately 160 feet in length. And what it was used for legitimately was that the Davises and their company would load up fuel on one of the islands in the Caribbean or one of the countries in Central America, and then take the fuel to a place where the fuel price was higher. And so they would just cart fuel around the Caribbean and Central America to skim profit on the differences in fuel costs among the countries.
Now, here's a little interesting twist. Had that boat been seized in the United States with drugs on board, what would have happened to the boat then?
Yeah.
You know, the federal government would probably still have it.
And would your client be joint and severally liable for any sort of
Well, according to the
proceeds of
Supreme
that?
Court, it's
I mean that it is an interesting that's an interesting issue for sure. And you know the other thing that I saw is you're talking about forfeiture and getting that. I mean, did they ever move for forfeiture? Did they ever move to forfeit the boat?
They did. So the way they do that there is they accuse the boat, which is similar in the structure to how they do it here. But in order to get the boat, they have to find that the owner of the boat is complicit in the criminal activity.
Yeah. What I mean, how did you get involved in this case? I mean, come on, dude. You're a lawyer from Houston. Now you're an international lawyer.
Well, I am an international man of mystery.
Yeah.
Here comes Netflix. Netflix is coming on this.
It kind of happened through two channels, and they happened at the same time. One channel was that Mr. Davis's one of his soccer buddies that he played soccer with had been acting in the role of a lawyer supporting him in his defense in the Dominican Republic, and that friend and that lawyer was then hired into the Ogg administration when Kim Ogg took office, so he had to leave. And in addition to that, I have had a pre-existing relationship with U.S. Rep. Kevin Brady, who presented me with my Eagle Scout Award back in 1991. And so Mr. Davis is a constituent of Congressman Brady, and so there was a dual referral from that office also.
I mean, just an incredible experience. Had to be something else to be a part of.
It changed my life, and it changed the philosophy with which I practice, particularly in my willingness to openly scrutinize and complain about the American system, and now I think I have license to do it in a comparative sense. It's not just I'm an American complaining about our system. I can say, look, I've been to the place that you call a banana republic, and it ain't much worse than what we've got.
Were there language problems?
I don't speak fluent Spanish, and Spanish is the official language of the Dominican Republic, and so I had a translator with me at all times, and Mr. Davis, my client, did as well.
Just fascinating, man.
In fact,
really
was he actually arrested down there,
Yes.
or so they didn't grab him in the United States and bring him back?
They called him on the phone and said, we've seized your boat, we've inspected it, and there's a problem, and we need you to come down and discuss it with us. So, that turned into critical trial evidence, because nobody who was involved or could have been involved with the transport of 985 kilograms of cocaine and 2 kilos of heroin would have said, okay, I'm on my way, and gone down there, and that's what he did.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and I'm just fascinated by this, Sean, because I mean, a lot of us have seen, you know, Locked Up Abroad or Broke Down Palace or some of these other movies, and you know, it gives you such a bad idea in your mind of what it can be like to go through the criminal justice system in a foreign country, and I think your story and Mr. Davis's story, I mean, just kind of gives us hope that it's not all just Travis Shamockeries out there.
Well, that's right. And at the same time, we were also very proactive here politically, and working with the State Department, and Congressman Brady and Congressman McCall exerted a lot of pressure on the embassy officials and the DR, who then, I mean, it was constant barrage of political pressure to try to get this case to trial. It could have easily gone on another year before it got to trial. So if there's a point where I'd say that yes, we got some traction and we got some recognition because of our government, it's in the speed with which we got this to trial.
Yeah.
So there's no Speedy Trial Act in the Dominican Republic.
Two questions for you. Was there ever any possibility or talk about a bond? And probably the more important question at this point is what media outlets have called for movie rights?
Well, you know, So I'll get to the first one, the second one first, just to get it out of the way. Nobody's called me. I don't know if they did, I'd be negotiating right now. But the bond was denied because the judges at that stage, and the different set of judges set bond, not the judges that took the case to trial. Those judges assessed that Mr. Davis was a flight risk, and they denied bond on that basis, which is exactly the same rationale that you would see in a case like this in the federal system.
I know if I was charged with something in the Dominican, I'd get my butt back to Texas in half a second. So, does it have to be a unanimous 3-0, 2-0 as far as the panel, or 2-1? Pardon me.
It has to be a majority, but so 2 out of 3. But from what I observed, there were 3 judges, and the judge in the middle was the president of that court. And it appeared to me that the other 2 deferred to her. And she was, at the end of the day, the most outspoken in her criticism of the government for their failure to prove the case.
Wow.
Well, great result.
Thank you.
I'm very proud of you. Not
Thank
just
you.
as a lawyer, but as a friend of yours as well. But,
Thank you, Jim.
But we got to get back across the Gulf of Mexico now and kind of talk about things that are happening here close to home. Let's start, guys, with what happened here today. And we'll kind of go from there because it's been all over the news. An incident that occurred 10 days ago now, about 10, 11 days ago, where a man outside of Denny's, a young man, 24 years old, was drunk, urinating outside the Denny's. And at some point, another patron came out, told the man to stop. There's two different stories of what exactly transpired next. 2 may have thrown a punch first and or whatnot, but ultimately the one man ends up on the ground, another man on top of him. That man is the husband of a Harris County Sheriff's deputy who is also on the ground next to them, holding this 24-year-old male down. Eventually, the man dies from the injuries suffered from the chokehold. That was on May 28th. Today, we have 2 indictments for murder for both the Harris County Sheriff's deputy and her husband. I guess I'm a little shocked at the speed at which this has happened. And I feel like that this is somewhat outside the norm. I know there was a huge protest, and as I was talking with Sean and our producer before the show, that was one of the biggest protests I've ever seen for a murder case.
I think there were a lot of people who were probably surprised at how long it did take. They were surprised that Mr. Thompson was not arrested on the scene that night as a result, which is what would have happened in most normal instances. There would have been an arrest at the spot, gone to jail, had some kind of charges filed, made a bond, and then worried about whether to get indicted later, which might have taken a month or 2 or 3 or more.
Correct. Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that that there was a sheriff deputy involved that caused a delay in anyone being arrested and/or charges being brought?
Well, I think it may have delayed the initial arrest because the officials at the scene may have said, look, we've got to tread carefully. This is the kind of thing that can backfire in our own department if we don't do it right. But I think then once you get past that hurdle, it may have expedited the process a little bit, particularly to the grand jury, because we have a situation where the public, at least some members of the public, are outraged, and there is a public accountability issue. So that's just the general way that I see it for now.
So let me take, for purposes of the show, let me take the prosecution standpoint. It's murder. This guy got on top of him, choked him, killed him, and then his wife came and assisted or aided and abetted in the murder of this young man. He's guilty of murder and should be prosecuted. What says you?
Oh, this is
This is where the fun begins, right?
It's almost too easy. A couple of things. First, Kim Ogg was very express today in saying that this is nothing more than a finding of probable cause. It's not a finding of beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a finding that has been tried before a jury. There's been no cross-examination or confrontation. It's simply the evidence presented to the grand jury. They thought there was probable cause for these charges. That's first. Second, despite the charges being filed, there is still a presumption of innocence. And no matter how much we want to ignore that in practice these days, that is the way it should be. It's a fundamental tenet of our justice system. And these two people are still presumptively innocent, the grand jury finding notwithstanding. The bigger picture at this point from my standpoint is all we know is what bits and pieces we've seen in the media. And nobody should be making judgments about guilt or innocence based on media reports that are, and no offense to my friends in the media, always incomplete and often wrong.
Well, and the interesting thing too is some of the statements by the lawyers representing the family, coming out and saying the video alone is evidence of guilt. So certainly we have lawyers who aren't even providing at least the presumption of innocence in this case. And the other thing I wanted to ask you guys, a statement was made today by our DA that the sheriff's deputy and her husband were given the opportunity to come in and talk, and they refused. That didn't seem appropriate to me.
Well, I think they were, I don't remember if she made the statement or she was asked about it, but she explained that there were 12 witnesses who testified before the grand jury. We know who a couple of them are because they made statements to the media outside the grand jury room. We don't know who they all were. And then said that the Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were invited to come speak to the grand jury, and they declined to do so. Frankly, if I'd been representing them, I would have probably told them not to go in there either.
Sure.
They would not have had a lawyer with them. They would have had no protections. It's simply not a smart thing for anybody who's being investigated to do.
But can't you hold someone down? And if you feel like your life's in danger, if you feel that there's a threat, can't you do that?
Well, now, I haven't seen the indictment. I don't know if anyone has yet. But if I speculate, which isn't something I'm allowed to do in a courtroom, but I'll do it here, of how the indictment reads, it probably says something like they were doing something that was clearly dangerous to human life and it caused death. And as to the wife, it may be that she acted as a party to it somehow by either encouraging or assisting in it. That's the general framework that I would expect to see this charge being put forth as. And so this is not, you can't equate this to, I'm going to go kill this person tomorrow as soon as they get home. It's not a premeditated murder, and it doesn't have to be under the statute. But that's what I would anticipate.
I agree with you, but I'm going to add one thing. My expectation would be that the indictment would have both a paragraph on intent to cause the death and a paragraph with the commit an act clearly dangerous to human life that resulted in death.
I agree with that, based on experience also, because they don't have to prove both. They can allege both and prove one.
And it is interesting, or at least Kim Ogg said this, that they indicted the wife solely on a theory that she was a party, because she clearly did not directly cause the death.
Right.
If she did it, if she's criminally responsible for it, it is solely as a party. I think by far that's the weaker of the two cases.
Sure.
Regardless of how it turns out.
I just tried to pull up the clerk's office here, and it has not been imaged.
Well,
Still
and
not up.
from the defensive standpoint, the way that I would start out approaching a case like this is that even in the sense of whether this was clearly dangerous to human life, did anyone know that this chokehold was clearly dangerous to human life, and was that the belief, or was somebody reckless about whether it was? People are put in chokeholds every day, and if someone is inexperienced with a chokehold or inexperienced with this particular decedent now and his physical condition, they may not have had that the needed intent to qualify under the statute.
I mean, there was a uniformed officer in New York City that choked a man to death.
With the cigarettes, wasn't it? He was selling cigarettes and choked him to death?
Yeah.
I think.
And nothing happened to that officer. Do you think this case was an overreaction to, and the guy who actually applied the chokehold is not an officer here, but we do have an officer involved. It seems to have drawn a huge number of protests, but do you think the reaction, the way this investigation proceeded in the last 10 days, was any sort of a reaction to what has gone on the last year and a half, 2 years with the highly publicized cases?
I think it may be partly that, and I think it may also partly be a function of the fact that there have been 400 and some odd consecutive police or law enforcement caused deaths that have never resulted in charges of any kind that contributed to her being charged. Having said that, prior to coming over here, I watched the interviews of two of the witnesses who testified before the grand jury, who at least told the media that they were at the scene watching it happen, begging Thompson to get off of the victim. and if they testify in front of the jury the way they spoke in front of the media, their statements were pretty compelling. Also, having said that, though, the murder may be a stretch here.
Yeah.
I think it's far more likely that this may turn into a manslaughter or a negligent homicide case of some kind. In fact, Kim Ogg was asked by the press at the press conference whether the grand jury considered any other charges other than murder. And her answer was negligent homicide, but not manslaughter. And I think there could be an argument both as to recklessness for manslaughter and negligence for negligent homicide. And that may ultimately be where this ends up.
And wouldn't that be a decision ultimately at the end of a trial, or possibly as part of a plea bargain? I mean,
Either way.
Either way?
Sure. And let me speak philosophically for a minute about your question about whether this happened quickly or unusually quickly. The criminal justice system in any organized society is basically a surrogate for vigilante justice. I mean, we don't want mobs of people coming down the street with torches at night deciding who is going to get it and how much they're going to get. And so if the public loses confidence or loses that feeling that our criminal justice system adequately addresses those vigilante urges, but in an orderly fashion. If the public loses confidence, then we do get outbursts of vigilante justice. So there's a legitimate reason for the system to act quickly, notwithstanding the merit, whether it's meritorious or not, of the allegations.
Why should the deputy be charged with murder?
The law in Texas provides that someone who with intent to assist commission of the offense does something that aids, encourages, solicits, attempts to aid commission of the offense is just as guilty as the person who did it. And having watched the video and read some other things about it, she was certainly encouraging the man underneath, the victim, or the alleged victim, to stay still, stay down, not move, and he continued to move. She also at one point, I believe, the video shows that she put her knee on his arm to hold him down, thus potentially at least assisting the commission of the offense. Her case is going to be a lot more difficult to make for the DA's office than the primary charge of Mr. Thompson.
And what is y'all's impression of the daughter getting involved and another witness at the scene getting involved and telling them, you can't do this, you can't record this, it's illegal to record this? What's y'all's impression on that?
Well, they may have learned that from Harris County Sheriff's Department circa 10 years ago.
From their own experiences with law enforcement.
Uninformed citizens. Let there be no doubt. It is perfectly legal. It is constitutionally protected to videotape anything you want in public, including actions of law enforcement or civilians.
Do you think that the individuals on that video knew what was going on, like this guy was going to die?
Well, that's the ultimate question, I think, is whether they knew or were reckless as to some lesser included. I can't speculate based on anything I've seen yet about what their state of mind was.
One of the witnesses who spoke to the media outside the grand jury room made a statement that said that he had turned purple for 10 minutes before he finally got off of him. That could be some evidence of knowledge, certainly perhaps of intent, depending on what she was saying at the time or what was communicated to him about the guy's condition underneath.
A lot of press, obviously, today. A lot of coverage over the last 10 days on everything. Probably fanning the fires on things. Realistically, guys, how long is it going to take for this thing to get to trial if it goes that far?
9 to 12 months. Yeah, 9 to 12 months in that ballpark. I mean, the court this has fallen in, I don't think the court's going to push either side that's not ready to go to trial. Just because there's an indictment doesn't mean either side is anywhere close to ready to go to trial. The work that they have had many people working on in the past week still has to be checked and double checked. All the witnesses who testified are going to be interviewed again by by both prosecutors and by defense lawyers. All the testimony at the grand jury is going to have to be transcribed and probably provided to the defense lawyers. I suspect there's going to be a lot of other work that has to be done before either side is ready for trial in this case.
Is there any way that there could be a deadly weapon finding or paragraph? And how?
Deadly weapon findings have been addressed and found sufficient in some cases where a person's fists, for example, could be used as one. But, typically it has to be more than just an ordinary use. Mike Tyson may have a deadly weapon, for example.
I may have a deadly weapon, for example.
I will be very.
You don't have a deadly weapon in NBA.
in your dreams.
That's for damn sure.
I would be surprised if this did not also allege a deadly weapon through the use of the arm. I would expect that to be there.
Okay.
Apparently, it was some sort of MMA fighter, and there are some reports that he may have had some prior criminal history. Does that come in? Should it come in, or how? I think it was a burglary of a motor vehicle like 20 years ago.
I think it's totally irrelevant to anything that happened here.
I tend to agree with you. I agree with you.
Now it'll certainly be relevant if they ever get to a punishment phase. And speaking of punishment phase, there's he's charged. They're both charged right now with murder. It is at least within the realm of possibility that even if one or both of them are convicted of murder, that 5 to 99-year life punishment range could shrink to 2 to 20 years,
Right.
based on a finding of sudden passion arising from adequate cause. And I don't think we know enough from any of the media reports to know whether or not there was sudden passion or whether it arose from an adequate cause.
I can tell you that
I would be shocked if that wasn't raised an issue at trial if it got that far.
if I came out of my favorite Denny's and saw Julio urinating, I think I'd be so passionate.
Hey, look, man.
I'm just glad that didn't happen when I was a teenager. I'd have been in big trouble back then.
Exactly. Well,
Let me ask you this. Okay, so it landed in Judge Johnson's court. She's a new judge, great press, very spotlight kind of situation. Stephen Driver is the chief prosecutor in there. Who prosecutes the case? Who do you think?
I don't think the DA's office has assigned anybody yet. It may be the trial court prosecutors, maybe somebody else.
Woo!
Well, I guess we'll find out. We'll obviously watch this case as it unfolds, and I'm sure we'll have, if there's anything else, we'll have somebody on to talk about it. Don't know who yet, but we'll get somebody. We've reached the halfway point of the show, ladies and gentlemen. So call in with your questions, 713-807-1794. Twitter is silent. So light it up here. Give us some questions.
I was about to ask whether anybody called. I figured this topic would light up the phone line.
It hasn't yet, but maybe our next one will, because everybody seems to have been tweeting and talking about this today. Of course, today was the testimony of former FBI Director James Comey.
Not everyone has been tweeting about it, Jimmy. I don't think that President.
It was the one time that the president has not been tweeting. Yeah, this is true. This is true. It's the one person who has not been tweeting. So, former Director Comey goes before the Senate panel today. Not a congressional panel, but a Senate panel. And of course, he voluntarily appeared. There were some awkward moments with John McCain and his questioning. But ultimately, they're asking him questions about his meetings with the president. Some very, very, very strange testimony in terms of him informing the president, you're not under investigation. And then this whole notion of, well, then I began to not trust him, and so I started making memorandums of it. And to the point where, well, this tweet caused me to then call a friend of mine to tell him the contents of the memo and leak it to the press. And say what you will about Trump. You can say he's a liar. You can say he's off his rocker. But damn it, Comey, I don't get this guy. I really don't get him because, he was removed by Rosenstein. He was removed by Trump based upon, whether you believe it or not, the memo of the Deputy Attorney General who said he'd acted improperly during the Clinton email investigation by usurping the power of then Attorney General Loretta Lynch, making findings of whether or not there was a criminal case to be had. And now what he's doing here Feel free to jump in, guys, but I cannot imagine that it is within FBI policy that once you are no longer an agent or an employee, that you can call up a buddy and tell the contents of a memorandum you had with a witness in a potential investigation.
Well, I think it may depend on how you made the memorandum and whether you made it in your official capacity or whether you recorded it in your personal notes. Now, so that draws other questions that, for example, if you're in your official capacity, is a memorandum that relates to that necessarily a government property? I think this has a lot of different tentacles to it.
I did not see the whole thing because unfortunately I was at the courthouse working this morning.
Right, like
But
the rest of
the clip that I saw, Comey simply said that he had a friend do it. Unless I didn't see it, I don't think he ever identified the friend.
It was a law school professor who has since been identified.
Oh, okay.
Who I don't know, I don't recall.
So Comey then must have still retained a copy of those records in order to give them to someone else to have them read it to somebody with the press. Frankly, I think his admission that he did that is a pretty good indication of his truthfulness. Mm-hmm. I don't know that anybody that they could have ever tracked down where that came from. They certainly couldn't have made the New York Times divulge it.
Right.
I'm not sure they could have ever tracked that down but for his admission. Mm-hmm. And given his openness in that regard, I think it speaks very well for his honesty.
I don't question his honesty or his truthfulness. I really question his methods here. And whether or not he is doing things, you know, he made a point to say that the president's conversations with me were inappropriate and out of line, leaving me alone in the room, asking Attorney General Sessions to step out of the room. Totally agree, inappropriate. But isn't he being a little hypocritical with some of the actions he's taken since the Clinton email investigation? I mean, he now has essentially almost an 8 month, almost a year now, track record of really not following any kind of historical protocol that the director of the FBI should follow, in my opinion.
Well, I don't know. I'm not a FBI director historian, but
You haven't watched J. Edgar Hoover's the J. Edgar Hoover movie?
No, but I know it was referenced today by some pundits. Yeah. I should probably watch it.
We should.
But what I'm seeing is a guy who, by his outward appearance, sees himself as a man of integrity and seems to be working toward fulfilling that, and feels that he has gotten boxed around by both political parties and manipulated, and he's the scapegoat here and then he's the scapegoat there. And I think he finally just had enough and said, you know what, I'm going to clear the air about this.
Do you guys see an obstruction case here?
Potentially, and here's the potential on this. First, it depends upon the things that Comey said happened being true. Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting that Comey repeatedly, or at least initially, said, "Lordy, I hope there are tapes." Right. It really puts the White House in a predicament at this point, given what Trump tweeted on, "You better hope there aren't tapes." And the last report I heard this afternoon was that the media, the press, has continued to, congressional committee has asked for it. And the Trump White House has said, well, we need more time to tell you whether there's tapes or not. Which is, if there are no tapes whatsoever, it's real easy to say nothing's taped.
Yeah.
If there are tapes, but only of some things, that raises some additional questions. You know, if you turn off a recorder when you're having this kind of meeting, that just almost screams consciousness of guilt going into it. So if there's some recordings of some meetings, but not of this meeting, I think Trump may have a problem in that regard.
And so, with regard to Troy's view that there may be an obstruction case, I concur. And to dissect the basis for that, it would be under 18 U.S.C. 1512, which is a broad statute that came in under the old Sarbanes-Oxley legislation that deals with basically corporate and political corruption. And not to just recite the whole statute, but it basically says that if someone corruptly attempts even to influence an official proceeding, and an investigation would be an official proceeding, that person is guilty of obstruction of justice. And it has a 20-year cap to it in that statute. Wow. And so the center point, I think, there may be two center points of this investigation into whether this occurred is, number one, whether Trump had a corrupt motive for doing it, and corruptly has been defined by the Fifth Circuit as just having an intent of some wrongdoing. And secondly, whether he believed that his actions would have an effect, or that he desired that his actions would have the effect of dissuading an official investigation.
Well, let me ask you this: under that, if his lawyer, a lawyer representing him, said, "Look, he with regard to the Flynn investigation," and saying, "I hope you can see yourself to letting this go," I mean, if he tries to argue the defense of, "Well, look, I could have easily I could pardoned him, and you couldn't have done anything about it," but instead, trying to exercise political balance, I chose this route. But he could come back today and issue a pardon, couldn't he? And that would be
He could. One of the things that we don't know, though, is exactly what Michael Flynn was being investigated for.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We know that publicly they've claimed he made some false statements to the vice president. It could very well be that he is being investigated for making false statements to the FBI.
And whether Trump's concern was superficially what he says, which is Michael Flynn's a good guy, I'm worried about Michael Flynn, or whether the concern was something broader, that I could be implicated in this, so leave Michael Flynn alone.
The whole thing plays out like some sort of movie that, hey, Comey, I need to talk to you by yourself. Hey, he's a real good guy, isn't he? I hope you can let this go. The whole thing plays out like some movie.
Imagine if you heard those same words being spoken in the Godfather movies. Would you take that as anything other than this is what I really want to have happen?
Right. Well, it's funny because I've been watching the new season of House of Cards, and I'm just like, hey, the stuff that's happening on here, I used to think, in watching the previous seasons, I was like, this really isn't all that plausible. Come on. They couldn't run this to that end. And now I'm like, it's actually believable, given everything that's gone on the last 4 months.
And the fact that Trump clears the room of his son-in-law, of the Attorney General, and orders them out of the room with just the two of them left, that pretty clearly says, I want to have a private conversation that other people don't hear, because the things I'm fixing to say, I don't want other people to hear and remember.
And then the bombshell that comes out today that Comey says, well, I expected Sessions to recuse himself because of some information that I have that's classified.
Yeah.
But even in the vignette that you were referring to, Troy, as Comey tells it, Sessions lingers for a while before leaving, because even he knows and senses that something's improper.
I have this vision of, Sessions kind of in the corner like, do I go or do I not? And then he kind of like stumbles out, and then Trump, the leader of the free world, has this conversation with Comey, and Comey, as he says, he's playing the what to say in his mind back and forth in his head, and he just says, sure, yeah, he's a good guy.
And I think we've all been in positions where we have felt intimidated and said something that was polite or dismissed or evasive or acquiescing just to get out of the situation, so that we could then decide what we should do about it.
To not have a confrontation at that moment when you're not prepared because you didn't expect what just came.
And how much of this can you chalk up to the fact that here you are, you have Sessions, he's been a U.S. attorney. He's been an assistant U.S. attorney. He's been a senator. I mean, he's been in government for basically his entire life. Same with Comey. And you have these guys who are career government employees, career bureaucrats, and they have this neophyte come in. Mm-hmm. I mean, to some extent, this is a guy who lives in the business world, and you alluded to The Godfather. He's a New Yorker. I mean, it's kind of like we joke about, Sean, with some of these FCPA cases and the bribery case. I mean, some of these countries, you ain't getting business done if you aren't bribing officials to get things done. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if somehow his awkwardness, Trump's awkwardness, so to speak, and these awkward conversations that Comey is describing have as much to do with his inexperience and lack of being in government as it does to perhaps a criminal intent that everybody's trying to make.
Have you talked to Paul Ryan today?
No.
Because that was exactly what Paul Ryan said.
I didn't even see that.
That was exactly
I didn't see it. Oh,
it's exactly what Paul Ryan came out and
said.
Paul Ryan came out and said, look, he was, my word, not his, a rookie. I forget the exact word he used, but he was a rookie, doesn't know how things work. He hadn't been around for all these years. And
I don't buy it.
Cut him a break.
I'll tell
right?
you why I don't buy it is because if you're running a billion-dollar empire and dealing constantly with other business people and interfacing with governments around the world, then if you hadn't already figured out that these are real concerns and real issues, then somebody told you this within the first week or month of your presidency. I don't buy that he's a neophyte. I don't.
Even beyond that, that pitch, and Ryan's pitch in that regard is, look, he just didn't know this was illegal, so don't punish him. And that defense doesn't sell anywhere, anytime, anyway, any place. The FBI indicts, and the feds and the states invite people all the time who said, are you kidding? That was really a crime? I didn't know that.
Well, and isn't it?
And especially as the president, he's responsible for it, even if he didn't know it was a crime.
Well, and
Right.
so many of the federal statutes too are not specific intent crimes, and I believe obstruction is one of those that's not a specific intent crime.
And there's no willfulness element to it. Now, there's going to be a constitutional debate, and I've seen Professor Dershowitz commenting on it widely over the last few days about whether the president can be held criminally liable for these acts. I don't buy it that it's that he's immune because of some penumbra of some executive power, but we don't know the answer to how that will ultimately be resolved.
The Supreme Court was given that issue back during the Nixon era. They did not have to address it when they ordered the tapes to be turned over. The argument that he can't be indicted while he's sitting is based in part on the clause that allows him to be impeached and then be prosecuted afterwards. It's also based on the fact that while he remains president, he could theoretically pardon himself. And obviously that couldn't happen afterwards. So indicting a sitting president, it's unclear. It's undecided. It's not ever been addressed in a meaningful way by any court. There are law review articles and very learned and professional people on both sides who have taken opposite positions on this. I think the odds of him being indicted while he is in the presidency are pretty slim.
Agreed.
I think the odds of him being indicted, if he were to be impeached, being indicted after he was impeached, are also pretty slim.
Agreed with that as well.
Yeah. And from a practical standpoint, all this that's going on, I mean, he removed 46, or asked for the resignation of 46 U.S. attorneys. The FBI is still without a director. What?
There was a nomination of
There was a nomination
yesterday, yes.
Correct, but we're still without a formal director. There's still a number of judicial benches that need to be filled. We don't have nominations for those benches. We don't have, I mean, I know there's vetting going on specifically.
I'll nominate you.
All rise.
I don't think I'll get past the Senate Judiciary Committee, but thank you for the offer,
Just have
Sean.
to stop
I'm not sure.
urinating in the Denny's
Yeah,
parking lot.
right? Exactly. That's Julio, not me.
Yeah, they don't care about us. It
But
is what it is.
practically on our level here, I mean, what's the effect that it has downstream, so to speak? All this chaos up in Washington.
I don't know, and I don't know if it really has a practical effect at the U.S. Attorney's Office level. I can't speak to that.
Publicly, with the public, I think there's two diametrically opposed responses. On the one hand, I think the people who think he has done something wrong are disappointed that there's not more going on to hold him accountable, he being Trump. And the same thing is true even if Trump's not responsible, even if he has done absolutely nothing unlawful. I think there's also some frustration in how long it's taking to figure out whether anybody in his campaign was connected to any of the Russian activities. The flip side of that equation is I think there's another set of people on the opposite side who think this whole thing is a complete utter waste of time, that no matter what happened, what anybody did, they'll just let it go and let Trump get on with what he wants to do.
And one of the problems with, and I agree that that's the analysis and the breakdown, the concern I have is that that there is a confusion of the issues among people who favor President Trump. And I agree that there needs to be an integrity of the office of the president, that once someone is duly elected and they have evident authority to serve as president, that we need to have the national stability for that person to continue acting in that role. I think that's a distinct and separate issue from the question of whether another country invaded our sovereign system of elections. And I don't think that the two should be as intertwined as they have been.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck a a big deal with that's a big deal with me. Yeah, the big deal. But also was that he says if there were any Americans that were involved in this, that's a big deal also, and I saw that and I said, oh, that sucks, because as a citizen, as a taxpayer in this country, I thought they're going to start looking to us now. I mean, is there going to be more inquiries? I mean, what's the sentiment that's going forward?
Well, let's look at it this way. Comey was asked directly whether he had any doubt that Russians of some kind were involved in either attempting to or actually hacking into some voting systems in this country during the election. And he definitively and firmly said, no, I have no doubt. He was then asked, is there any question in your mind that the Russian government and Russian officials were involved? And he also definitively said, no doubt. Let's assume for the sake of this argument that that is true. That alone doesn't implicate anybody in this country. It doesn't implicate anybody, either Trump or in the Trump campaign. On the other hand, if there were people in the United States that aided and assisted and cooperated in that, and it doesn't matter whether it's a construction worker or whether it's somebody that worked on the president's campaign, if there were people who aided and assisted that, then they need to be held accountable.
And that's borderline, if not actual treasonous. It's a betrayal to allow another country, particularly a country that's in a competitive stance to us globally.
You can call him an enemy.
An enemy. Or a frenemy. Well, probably.
Right.
To undermine the essential pillar of our democracy and how we define ourselves. And ironically, particularly given that that country does not have that same pillar of democracy that operates currently.
And what started off, I think, as just an investigation of what Russia did in the election, I think has now turned into three other distinct things.
And they will continue to multiply.
Yeah, the first question is, were there other people who aided that? I think they've already answered the question, did Russia do this? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean they're ready to charge anybody in Russia with doing it, but I think they've answered that question. Next question is, are there people in this country, top to bottom, that aided or assisted that in any way? Then you have the National Security Advisor, whose name I just drew a blank on, who was fired. Who resigned.
Clapper?
No, National Security Advisor in the White House, who lied to the Vice President. Flynn, yeah. Then you've got the issue, what kind of statements he made to various people and what other people knew in that regard. So you've got his issue. And now, and this kind of feeds back to the Watergate era, you have a separate inquiry about whether there is a attempted cover-up by the president or others that affects any of the other inquiries. And it goes back, perhaps goes back to that old saying that sometimes the cover-up's worse than the crime.
Well, and now we have an NSA employee, an NSA leak employee who was, I guess, an former Air Force linguist, who then
San Antonio or something.
No, in Georgia.
Oh, it was Georgia.
It was Georgia, and the not aptly named reality winner.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Like, how do you?
Maybe she had a false sense of security.
Well, yeah, exactly. Her parents set her up for that.
Yeah.
False clearance of security.
But so now we have. There's been, you had Chelsea Manning, formerly Bradley Manning, charged with leaking state secrets, and President Obama pardoned her or commuted her sentence, I believe. So now we have our first prosecution for this in this administration.
This looks like just a foolish lapse in judgment.
Yeah.
More than any calculated attempt to make a point or inform the public of anything. It's just foolish.
The document was marked top secret, but there really wasn't much of anything in it that was going to harm the government in any way from it being disclosed. It was embarrassing because it hadn't been disclosed otherwise, but that's probably the extent of it. And frankly, the way she did it almost begged to get caught.
Yeah.
It was
so unsophisticated.
It was amateur hour.
Yeah, and I really couldn't. A lot of people are trying to link this to what's going on in Washington. I just didn't find any link to it. I mean, this just seemed to be some really one-off, just strange deal by a person with a strange name.
Although she also has a belief that the Washington empowered are going to make her disappear. That's what she's.
Have they had a mental health evaluation yet?
Yeah.
There may be one in order.
That might be that might be on order.
You know where people go to disappear? The Dominican. I'll tell you that. Unless you hire Sean Buckley, then you get to come home. He's home now, right?
He's home, yeah.
Or previously, they would say if you're connected to the Clintons in some way.
Right.
Ah, that's right.
Especially
Body
if your name
disappear.
is Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, or just the DNC in DNC in general now.
Right.
With what's the latest guy that they had this controversy on?
I don't recall the latest.
Well, the guy, the staffer who's accused of leaking all the emails from the DNC to WikiLeaks.
Oh, I don't remember his name.
Yeah, I don't remember his name offhand, but I mean, it's just now there's all
Seth Rich.
Seth Rich. That's right. Thank you very much. Seth Rich.
Who was that?
It was the voice in the sky.
Big brother.
But do you think we're as a society, we're sitting here talking about the Russians hacking our election. We're talking about leaks. I mean, are we now, because of social media and because of living in the 24-hour news age, are we just talking about things a lot more than we should? I mean, I just have a hard time believing that this is the first time the Russians have tried to interfere in our elections. I really just have a hard time believing this.
I
is the first
agree
time
with
they've done
that. But I think we're living in this kind of altered universe because now there's been this dialogue nationally about whether the news that we're hearing is even legitimate.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I even have an opinion on that. I have my own frustrations with the media, but they serve a purpose. Is everything slanted? Well, sure, most of it is. And I think that a lot of people are getting this feeling, especially younger people who don't have the same experiences that we had growing up, that the world is just this multitude of realities.
The slant, interestingly, I don't think is so much a bias in the content of what's reported. I think it is in the bias of what is not reported.
Right.
The snippets they choose to report that frame it one way or the other, which is why I said a while ago, media always incomplete.
Right.
And I think the curtain got pulled back on this with Snowden.
Right.
We're talking about all these conspiracies and the what ifs, and I think Snowden made a lot of people begin to realize that there's lots of things going on in the government that they would facially deny that in fact were going on. There's a lot more snooping by the government. There are things that we would have not dreamed they were actually doing under the Constitution that they in fact were doing, and frankly I'm not sure we've seen the full extent of that. And it makes people more willing, I think, to believe that there are other backdoor things going on. And the latest lady who released that one memo as well, it pulled back the curtain again on something else.
Yeah.
And while I'm not condoning many of President Trump's statements or his methods, I do think that he's correct that there are levels of government that operate for their own motives and on their own wavelengths that are outside the control of the executive branch or the hierarchy of the executive.
And on that note, we're running out of time, so we're going to leave you on the conspiracy theory note.
I love it, man. I was going to just tie it all down. Yeah, like Harris County. Who knows what they're doing, man?
You're not paranoid if they're really coming after you.
Well, this is a great show, guys. I appreciate you guys coming on. And
Thanks for having us.
again, congratulations, Sean. That was
Thank you,
a
Jim.
great result.
I agree. Big win.
Thank you.
Really, 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 just a great story, and I'm glad that you got that result for your client.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Troy, appreciate you coming on, man.
You bet. Always happy to be here.
Absolutely. Julio, better luck next year in your finals prediction.
I said Golden State in 4.
Yeah.
There's a tape somewhere.
We can go to YouTube and find out.
Lordy, I hope there is.
Right? That's all the time we have for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week on another new episode of Reasonable Doubt. Good night.